Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome back to The Unseen Paranormal. Today we're talking to D.N. English. D.N. is a freelance writer, publisher, and author of many books, including Ghost of Downtown Jackson. We're going to discuss the history and hauntings of this small West Tennessee town. Hey Dee, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for asking me.
So you wrote a book about haunted Jackson, mainly the downtown area of Jackson. So how did you get into the paranormal to come to write the book to begin with?
I grew up in the paranormal. My great-grandmother and her friends were always into the paranormal. She had a Choctaw background, and some of her friends did too. But you know how someone tells you they have imaginary friends, and it turns out that they're actually seeing someone from the past?
Yeah.
Well, that's what I grew up hearing about and experiencing. So as I went on through college, I started studying the paranormal from an academic standpoint. You know, listening to the stories and hearing all the ghost stories as you grow up, it's really interesting. But studying behind the scenes and the psychology, it was just fun. And I figured I wasn't crazy. So that was good.
Yeah.
Because of my imaginary friends. But the stories of Jackson are so varied and so, like you said, rooted in history. Because Jackson was a small town. It came into being in 1822. So they're getting ready to celebrate their bicentennial.
Yeah, and that's a lot of history.
Oh, yeah. But there was one building where I had my private investigating office called the Pythian Building. And it was just so full of wandering spirits that it was fun because I used to work late at night and write when nobody was downtown. And you could hear things and you could see things. And as you research the history of the building, because I love to research the buildings, somebody asked me why I didn't do more ancestry and on the people. Well, the buildings don't argue with you.
Right.
Their history is in black and white. But the Pythian Building, at one time, it was the Knights of the Pythian that owned it, and they had their lodge on the third floor. But on the side, you had an entrance to go into a great opera house. Now, during the 1890s, the opera troops would stop in Jackson and perform before they went, say, Memphis, St. Louis, or New Orleans. They would take the train and they'd stop. Well, there was this one opera singer. She was supposedly amazing. Her name was Sarah. She was raven hair, full figure, and full of life. And needless to say, she had a heavy fan base among the men. Well, one night she was there and her husband came from Chicago and wanted to talk to her, and she laughed at him because he accused her of cheating on him. Well, unfortunately, while he was doing this accusing, her friend came in to visit. Well, there was a confrontation and everything seemed to blow over, but later that night, the Pythian caught fire, and it burnt the fourth floor where the dressing rooms were. Well, everybody thought people had gotten out. But what they didn't know, Sarah didn't get out. She was killed in the Pythian fire.
Wow.
And the women of the Pythian didn't want the building rebuilt. They didn't want it restored because they were mad at the men for bringing these ladies into town. But the men won out and they restored the building, but they didn't have an opera house anymore. Well, it wasn't long after they built this back that people started seeing things. And all of a sudden they would see a shadowy figure or they'd smell vanilla. And Sarah was always known for wearing vanilla, as the ladies of the time did. That was their cologne. So she had been seen several times in the Pythian Building. I was doing a story on air one night, and I had a photographer who was, as we should say, full of figure. And he was listening to the story, and we were doing it. and all of a sudden he saw a shadow. Well, it scared him. When we were on the third floor, because remember, they didn't rebuild the fourth floor. We were on the third floor. He cleared the steps from the third floor landing to the second floor and kept running. So we didn't know why. And finally, the reporter went down to talk to him, and he came back and he started laughing. He said he smelled vanilla. I did not have the heart to tell him that I was burning vanilla candles in my office. So of course he smelled vanilla. But on other times you could smell vanilla and there were no candles burning. So there were really a lot of great stories in that building and all over downtown Jackson, really.
A lot of the small towns I've heard around Tennessee, like Murfreesboro and Gallatin, a lot of the town squares, there's a lot of fire history and natural disasters that took people's lives, especially back then. You know, they didn't have the fire protection we have now, didn't have the fire departments put fires out and to save people. And so you had a lot of people perish in fires like that.
Well, during the 1800s, when the town was formed and when they got gas pipelines in downtown Jackson, they used hollowed out logs to send the gas through from the gas pumping station downtown to light the lights, not only in the buildings, but the gas lights on the street. So there were a lot of cases of fire then. It was just amazing. But you know, the spirit of the tree, that's one that always intrigues people. And everybody's got this tree. On Court Square in Jackson, there is a tree that has been standing there since the building of the courthouse. And they have trimmed it, and quite obviously they didn't know what they were doing, so there are several knots in that tree. So that tree has seen wars. It's seen the Civil War. It's seen World War I with all the soldiers going off to war. It's seen hangings where people were hung on the courthouse square. And it's just amazing to get there at night, sit across in front of City Hall, and look across at that tree, because you can see the spirit. You can see the faces in the tree, and you can imagine what all it's seen. There's so many stories about downtown and about the ghosts that are there.
Yeah, and the town square is downtown because that was the center of life back, 100 years ago or more. And so that's where they did hangings and stuff, because they would just take you out of the courthouse and hang you if they found you guilty. They didn't wait around like, we do now with appeals and that type of stuff in our legal system. They just took care of it. So you hear a lot of stories from all these small towns about the downtown being haunted, especially around like hanging trees and like around the courthouse and courthouses being haunted.
All right. I'd just gotten back from Canada. This is in the 70s. And a friend of mine called me because they were from Duke and they were going to do a study in Jackson. And I picked them up from the airport and we came to Jackson, and there's this house in downtown Jackson up on a hill that during the Civil War it served as a hospital, for both the Union and the Confederate soldiers at that time. And the people that owned it, when we came there, he was just convinced that it was part of the Underground Railroad and it was haunted. Well, they proved through their readings and everything there was paranormal activity in that house. But where he said it was the Underground Railroad was a cistern. So quite obviously, he wasn't really familiar with country living.
Yeah.
So, it wasn't. It was just amazing to hear him tell that story. Well, I wrote the story about it and about the general that walked the halls and different people that had been there because, during the Civil War, they would just do surgery. They would amputate. They wouldn't try to save something. And at one time in the yard, they said there were just stacks and stacks of body parts. And the cries of the soldiers could be heard down the hill. Well, I wrote this story about it, and later a group of Christian ladies got the house and put in a mission for ladies that did not have a place to go after they got out of jail. So I got a call. They were angry with me. They say, "How dare you say this place is haunted?" And I said, in the 70s, it was haunted. And I honestly don't think it is, because there's so much good going on now. So I think they've moved on,
yeah,
trying to smooth over. Well, I have you know, we do not believe in ghosts. And I said, stop. You are a religious group, right? And they said, yes. I said, what do you say? We want to thank the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Now you're going to tell me you don't believe in ghosts? It stopped the conversation dead. But I proved my point because not everybody believes that there's spirits walking on this earth. Not everybody believes in the paranormal. And that's perfectly fine. We're all built out of different cloths and we all come across differently. And what we believe is our own personal belief.
Right.
But there are a lot of things that are not explainable. And those are some of the things that I like to write about and I like to explore. I like to find out who was in that building and what happened to them. And it's just interesting. And if you see something like we have a restaurant now in downtown called the Blacksmith, which is funny because back in the 1800s, it was a blacksmith. And they did tan hides there. And they had a gentleman there that tanned the hides that unfortunately had cancer, which, of course, then they didn't know what it was. They just knew that he had a growth and he literally did not have a nose. It was just a hollow thing. And he would sit outside and tan the hides because he couldn't smell them. Well, the stories were that the kids would run around and try to avoid him and everything. And then all of a sudden, in the early 1900s, he started coming back and sitting in front of what later became a fish cafe. And people would see him at night. And they would not admit they saw him, but they would walk by and they would catch an odor of a tanning hide. And it's funny because he still appears downtown every once in a while. And he still sits in that chair right outside that restaurant now.
Yeah, and that's an interesting history too of how this guy was disfigured because of a medical condition, and so now when people see him, they don't have to, if they see a full body apparition, they kind of know, from the story about this guy who he is, and just kind of adds more to the
tale. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I love about doing the show that I didn't realize when I started doing my podcast was that I kind of stepped into this role of trying to keep these stories alive. And so that's kind of to get them out for more people to hear and kind of keep this alive. And so that's why I love talking to people like you, because you've written a book that keeps these stories alive for more generations to hear.
Yeah, and for 14 or 15 years, on Halloween, right before Halloween, I would tell ghost stories downtown. And it was in the guise of getting people to learn about the history of downtown. But if you're telling a ghost story and you're giving the history of a building, they listen to you.
Yeah, because they're being entertained at the same time learning something.
Right. And that's the trick. Because we can all learn from the past. We know that. And we can learn from the stories that our grandfathers and our grandmothers told us. And you can remember growing up as a child, sitting by a fire and listening to that one special ghost story.
Yeah.
And that's just part of our makeup. That's part of our history. And we don't want to lose it. And we want to listen and learn. And that's the fun part of what I do, because I try to teach and introduce them to people of the past. Now, in Madison County, we've got an area called Denmark, Tennessee. And that is just so full of history. And it's got so many great spirits that roam down there. And they tell the history of what happened. Because Denmark is right on the Hatchie River. And that's where a lot of the settlers came before, Madison County was formed. And they were more or less squatters, but they had land and they built their places to live, and they got along with the Indians. At that time, it was the Chickasaw that lived in that area. And the Chickasaw would teach them how to do things, but they would also share the stories of the spirits, like of Estonali, which is the river down there. It's crossing right at the river. how the Indians used to cross there, and some of them drowned there, but their spirits were still there. Or how they came across the river and went to Pinson Mounds, where they had ceremonies. That was the religious place of several different tribes. They would come there to hold their burials and hold their spiritual meetings. And Pinson Mounds was an archaeological dig for University of Memphis or Memphis State. And it's still there, and it's got so much history you can learn. And you walk through the area and walk through the mounds, and you can feel the spirits. Just like when you walk around Forky Deer River or go down to Hatchie River, you can feel and see and imagine what went on back then.
Yeah, and it's just that places like that is just a different feel to them. Whether you believe in paranormal or not, it's just a different energy that you can feel.
And it's just, you open your mind for just wonderful thoughts and wonderful pieces of history. And you wonder, what did these people do? How did they survive? And then like Riverside Cemetery in Jackson. It's one of the oldest cemeteries in this area. And you walk around and you read the tombstones. And it's just amazing. A little girl that died at 6, that died of scarlet fever. And you just can't imagine how their family felt. And then you go back to the back of the cemetery, and there are the graves of the unknown soldiers from the Civil War, from both camps. And one day we were back there doing a tour, and I was talking to someone, and they looked at me and they said, "Did you see that?" I said, "Did I see what?" "There's a man over there walking." And I looked over there, and there wasn't anybody there. I said, "What do you see?" She said, "He's in a soldier's uniform, and he's walking." And I said, "Why don't you walk over there and just say the words, 'You've done a good job. Go home. Your family waits.'" And she got up and she walked over there and she did it. And she came back and she said, "He's gone. He was just waiting for permission to leave."
Yeah.
And she said, "I've never done that before." I said, "Well, open your mind. You'll find you'll do it again."
With being a paranormal researcher and investigator and doing the show, a lot of people will come up to me and be like, "I don't believe in ghosts, but this is my story." And so even if they don't want to believe that all of this is possible, lots of people still have unexplained things that happen to them like that is out there.
Right, because they think they're going to be committing a weakness by saying, "I believe in ghosts," or "I see a spirit." Oh, no. We all have this ability. We all have this extra sense if we open our minds and let it happen. And that just not be afraid of it.
Right. And sometimes it just takes paying more attention to your surroundings.
Oh,
and what's
right.
going on.
I mean, how many of our friends do we both know that are too busy to notice a rose that's blooming by the side of the road?
Yeah.
Let alone a spirit that's just wandering around waiting to be seen or heard.
Yeah, and that gets into the territory of like a lot of people, if their house, is haunted, they might think that it's something negative or evil because of some of the things it does, but it might just be trying to get their attention because they're not paying attention.
Oh, right. When I was in the Pythian building, I had an office that was a storage office, and told them I had a poltergeist. They said, "No, you don't." I said, "Yes, I do." I said, "I'll prove it to you." And one night I had a friend stay up there. She says, "You do not have a poltergeist." And I said, "Listen." And all of a sudden, CD racks fell over in that room. And CD covers started throwing. I mean, they were going all over the room. And she looked at me because I had the camera on. I mean, we were not in there. I had the camera on that room. And it was so funny. She said, "You do have a poltergeist." I said, "Yeah, and he is a stinker." I said, "He doesn't do that all the time, but he'll get mad about somebody that's been in the office or something he saw out the window, and he'll throw a fit. And the girls in the office would come in and have to clean up that room every once in a while." My best story is when one of my employees had stayed up there working on a book, editing a book, and she had stayed up. And all of a sudden, I had cameras facing the hall for safety reasons. And all of a sudden, she heard something. And the camera picked up 2 police officers coming down the hall, and they had their guns drawn. And they were saying, you know, this building's haunted. I know something's in here. Of course, she was in there. And you heard this. Of course, when they got to the door and she answered the door, everything was all right. Well, the next day I called the police chief and I said, come see my tape. And he looked at it. He said, I am so embarrassed. I said, no, you're not. I said, you're just as guilty as those officers because you think this building's haunted. But I did destroy the tape. I wasn't going to embarrass them. But, you know, people just, they can't imagine. There's another building at the corner of Lafayette and Liberty, I believe it is. And the people in there have seen the ghost, and they hear the ghost, and they hear them giggling because they used to be lovers. And the lady that was the telephone operator back then, this would be back in the 1800s, she was a telephone operator, and the other gentleman was a cotton buyer in one of the other offices, and he had fallen in love with her. But she was older than he was, and he just didn't think he was worthy. So he went off to Memphis to do some training. Well, he stayed away just as long as he could. He bought an engagement ring to bring back to the telephone lady. Well, one day before he got back, unbeknownst to him, she had gone downtown and had accidentally stepped in front of a streetcar that was drawn by mules, because that's what they were then. They didn't have electric streetcars, and she was killed. Well, when he got back, he found out she was dead. 4 days later, they found him dead, sitting at her graveside. Well, from that point on, people in that building, and to this day, they can hear them giggling and laughing and having a good time, because that's where they were happy, and that's where they are. In a lot of the houses, like you say, people experience ghosts. They experience spirits, and they think they're up to no good. No, not necessarily. That may be their happy place, and they don't want to leave yet.
Right.
So they're still there. I've got a ghost in this house, Miss Sue. We bought the house from Miss Sue when she died unexpectedly. And every once in a while, you'll hear the alarm go off on the door and there'll be nobody. But we know, or I know, that that's Miss Sue. And in the past, we could see her outside, standing by her tomato garden. Of course, the tomato garden's gone. But she loved that garden, and she loved this house. And then in the middle of the night, if I got up to write and go into my office, I would go through what we converted into a large bathroom to get to my office, and I could smell cashmere bouquet.
Wow.
Which was the powder she wore. But, yeah, it didn't scare me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think she approves. I don't know if she approves of my cat, but I think she approves of what we did to the house.
Yeah, and a lot of times you'll hear stories about, you know, paranormal activity kicking up whenever you renovate a place, or and maybe it's because the spirits they don't like what you're doing, or they don't want you to change because they're used to it being however they built it or how they were used to it and that type of stuff.
Oh, yeah, because I had a gentleman friend that had a house over on North Highland in Jackson, and he was renovating it, and he had a spirit in there that every night he went to bed, the spirit would move one of his plants and put it back where it was. And he put cameras, and, you know, you could see the plant moving, but you couldn't see why it was moving. And so he was real concerned about that, and I said, well, look, Frank, if it's bothering you, put the plant back where he had it, and you won't be bothered. He did, and he wasn't.
Right.
So, you know, I said, that's a simple solution, because he didn't bother anything else in the house. So he was pleased with what he had done otherwise, except for that one plant. And that's like Miss Betty, who was in my office. She was the secretary for the attorney up there, and she was a stickler. And I would go in, I would leave my glasses on the conference table, and I'd go in the next morning. My glasses were on my desk where they should have been. I mean, I don't know how many times that happened or how many times I left papers out on the conference table and they were back in the file folder the next morning and nobody had been in there.
Yeah, so they're just trying to help out.
Oh, yeah. I mean, she was a stickler. But everybody's got stories like this, and everybody can realize what these stories are about, and especially in downtown, in the heart of the city. We've been talking about Jackson, but can you imagine the stories in Milan or Alamo or in Trenton?
Yeah.
Or in Chester County, or just so many of the small towns that aren't small anymore, but, you know, they started out small, and they started out with special histories. We've got the history of the railroad here. My favorite story of the railroad is there was a gentleman, Mr. Wallace, who was a very wealthy landowner. In his later years, I was at a fundraiser, and I sat at the table with him. He looked at me, he said, Dee, do you know that I was an engineer on the railroad? I said, no, sir, I did not know that. He said, yes. And I wrecked a train. I said, you did? He said, yes. He said, just like Casey Jones, I wrecked that train. I didn't die, I lived. But you know what happened? I said, no, sir, what happened? He said, I got fired. I said, well, I'm sorry to hear that, sir. And he said, well, it's the truth. Said they immortalize him and fire me. I said, well, things like that happen.
With all your research for doing the book and all the stories that you've heard and all the experience you've had, what do you think is the most haunted place in downtown Jackson?
Oh, the Pythian building is the most haunted. Now, the old City Hall, well, yeah, it still is, but it's been changed so much that I don't think a respectable ghost would be there. Where the City Hall is now used to be the First National Bank building. And they blew up the bank building to create this City Hall we have now. And there's still different spirits that hang around on that block because Jackson was notorious. I mean, we had a sheriff that got shot trying to enforce the booze law. And it's just things like that. And the man that shot him had worked at the railroad and had created a body armor suit so he could shoot him. Well, the sheriff who had been hurt had one eye out. This one-eyed sheriff shot the man in the head where he did not have his body armor suit on and killed him. Well, he went through all sorts of stuff, but that man, every once in a while, you'll see roaming around. And, of course, we've got the New Southern Hotel, which is now a residential area for elderly people. But that has all sorts of wonderful stories in it. The little girl that stands in the window when she came to town to watch the parade and died the next day because they didn't know she was so sick. But yeah, they're just all sorts of great stories and great buildings. Of course, they've destroyed a lot of them.
Yeah. Some of the spirits will still be attached to the land. So even if they put a new building there, you might still have activity.
And we do. And you know, you'll know this all over in Nashville and New Orleans, even Memphis. Oh my gosh. Memphis around the river, all the spirits.
Yeah.
And then on the river, because on the Hatchie River, where people came to settle in Madison County and in different counties, you know, they not only had to fight off Indians, but there were like pirates that would raid the boats of the settlers. So those spirits are still there. Or the ferry that went across from the old Hatchie station where the two little kids fell off and drowned. They still appear down there. So, you know, there are all sorts of spirits.
There's a couple of places I want to ask you about that are in around Jackson. One of the famous stories that I know of from just living in Tennessee is the Hartsbridge Road. Everybody's heard this ghost story from all over, but this one is actually specifically in Jackson.
Well, there's several versions of it. One is there was a lady that was living on Hartsbridge Road, close to where the bridge is now, and her husband had been away at the Civil War, and she had taken a lover, and he came back and cut her head off. And one of the stories is she still wanders around Hartsbridge Road because her body was never found. They never knew exactly what happened, but not long after he disappeared, she started haunting that area down there. And when we had that tornado back in 2003, there was a lot of disturbance down there. And boy, she showed up everywhere. I mean, I kept hearing stories. I kept getting phone calls. Can you believe it? I said, yeah, I can believe it. And, of course, all the guys used to take their girlfriends down there to scare them when they parked down there. What was the other one you've heard?
The one that I was talking about that you've kind of heard from all over the country is that if you turn your car off, the spirits will mess with your car.
No, I heard that too, but I always heard that was the teenage kids doing it.
Yeah.
Because not only was there a ghost story about that, but they were sure there were UFOs controlling that area. They were messing with people's electrical systems in the car, and we won't even go there.
Yeah. And then there's a story of Bascom Road.
Now, which one is that? I don't remember that one.
It's apparently there's a ghost dog that has red eyes that people have seen.
Oh, the wolf.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that, but no, I've never seen that, and I've never heard the complete background about it. I've just heard bits and pieces of it. But I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. And kind of with paranormal stuff, you'll kind of have, especially places that are kind of hot spots for ghosts and spirits, you'll kind of have some of the other phenomena thrown in, like cryptids. Like in that story with the ghost or wolf with red eyes, you'll have some of that stuff thrown in too. And some people will tell the story of that it's a ghost dog, or and some people will say it's a cryptid. It's a actual physical animal that's manifesting, whether it be paranormal or actual real animal.
Well, what is it? The skinwalkers that the Indians used to believe, or the shifters, where men and women would shift into animals. Yeah, that's one of the old Indian faith beliefs, that they would go up on the mountain and they would take on the spirit that they were, and they would fly over like an eagle, or they'd be a wolf or a bear. I mean, those stories have been going on forever. Yeah, and those stories fascinate me with the Native American folklore, because the skinwalker, as people know of it, that legend nowadays is more of a Navajo, Western United States kind of folklore, but a lot of other tribes had a similar folklore. Oh, right. Had a similar story. And these tribes never met, never mingled, never, they didn't travel easily like we do now from one side of the country to the other. And so they spent lifetimes, and never, hundreds of years, and never crossed paths. So for them to have similar stories and some of the same legends and folklore just fascinates me that, there's no way that these people ever traded stories. So how did they get the same folklore and same legend? Yeah, because, you've got the Chickasaw Indians that were in this area, and then the Choctaw Indians that were in northern Mississippi and in Alabama. They've got all sorts of stories about the shifters and the spirits, and, of course, the shamans and the special stuff they did. And my great-grandmother, her friends would tell me stories about the lady shamans from the Choctaw. And then I'd hear the stories of the healers. I mean, you've heard those, where there are people out there that can heal with a touch. Yeah. And they used to say, oh, they're witches. But no, they've got a special gift, and they do it. Yeah. And there are people that have a special gift that see spirits. Yeah, and in Native American culture, those people were revered. They weren't feared. They weren't ostracized. They were up at the higher echelon of the society. Right. And they were honored. And somehow we have lost the honoring and the keeping the old stories alive from the elders. Of course, nowadays people don't even listen to their elders. Right. And that's sad. I'm part of the millennial generation and kind of at the very beginning of it. Luckily for me, I think I'm lucky that I was raised by my grandparents, because I feel like I got kind of they taught me the respect your elders. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Yes, sir. No, sir. All of that. And I think I turned out as an adult better off because of it. I, too, was raised by my grandparents, and I learned a lot, from them and from their peers. And like you, I learned that yes, ma'am, and no, sir, and yes, sir were just what you did. And you did it in honor. And also, like you were talking about, just hearing the stories from them and that were passed down
from their grandparents, maybe some of the paranormal stories or just some of the interesting stories that they had to tell, or the interesting things that happened in their life and their own paranormal stories. In
Oh,
my
right.
family, I was also lucky to grow up with a family that was very open about paranormal. And I've heard lots of paranormal stories about when they lived in this, they first moved down to Tennessee from up north and lived in this haunted house where an older lady, she was kind of like a caretaker spirit, would come and tuck the kids in at night and kind of watched over them. And of course, all my aunts and uncles, they were, deathly afraid of this lady, but she wasn't there. She never did anything to hurt anybody or, anything that was malicious in any way. And so I grew up listening to those stories, and I think that's part of the reason I'm so into the paranormal and into hearing other people's stories.
And it really is a blessing, and it's a gift that you have been given that you should appreciate. And people that are given this gift of understanding and the ability to listen should be honored to hear the stories of the elders and to think about things that could be and not just wipe them out as hearsay.
Right.
Just give them a chance. But that's why paranormal study is so interesting to me, because you can learn so much. And it's not to be feared. Of course, there are, like the stinker in the office, there are some spirits that are not necessarily nice. But those that I have encountered are in the minority. The rest of them have always been very kind.
Yeah, and I've always looked at it like, if you're a nasty person in life, you're probably going to be a nasty person in death.
No joke.
Yeah, if you're going to stick around and be a spirit, you're probably not going to be very nice. If you were just like an old codger in life, just hated everybody and was just grumpy, then you're probably going to be that way in death as well.
Right. There's some people that are still on this earth there's some spirits that are still on this earth that are waiting for permission to move on. And it's more like the little story they tell. Well, they don't want you upstairs and they don't want you downstairs, so you're stuck.
Right.
So they can't move on. And I've got people like the story in the cemetery where they're just waiting for permission to move on. They're waiting for the finishing of the story so they can move on.
Yeah, and maybe some spirits don't even know that they're dead.
I agree with you on that, because I have encountered some that I honestly think they're still on this earth. The way they act and the way they present themselves.
Yeah.
And what do? You can't go up and say, "Hey, by the way, you're dead."
Right.
Sorry, but that bullet wound you've got, that means you're dead. And
right.
there's some that lost their lives by violence. Like one of the ladies that used to work for Ollie Poe, who was the Madam of Jackson. She was shot with one of her lovers. And of course, they never did figure out who killed her. But every once in a while, you can still see her. She was a striking redhead. And every once in a while, you'll see her downtown, or you'll see her down on Royal, where Ollie Poe's house used to be, close to Royal. But, there's some like that. Liza's ghost, the lady that was hung on Courthouse Square. On certain days, on certain Wednesdays, if the wind is blowing and you're downtown and you're close to that tree, you can hear her say, "I didn't do it. I didn't do it."
Wow.
You can just hear the words.
Yeah. Because
she was hung. That was a really weird story. She was drugged out of the jail on a Wednesday night after prayer meeting. They rang the bells and the people left their churches and came to Court Square where they hung Eliza. And she kept saying, "I didn't do it. I didn't do it." Well, she didn't die from the hanging. Shots rang out and somebody had shot her and she died. The next day, the sheriff went down there and cut her down. And she didn't die from the hanging. She died from the shooting. And the gentleman who was the husband of the mistress that died, all of a sudden left Jackson. Within months, he was married to a lady in St. Louis. So if we had CSI back then, I bet they could prove she didn't do it.
Right. And yeah, and that goes to the whole thing of that, you know, some of the spirits just want to be heard.
Right.
And want their story told. Yeah.
They do. I mean, they just want somebody to remember them. And as paranormal investigators, that's what you and I do.
Right.
We try to remember them and let other people hear their story. Like the lady that would tuck your aunts and uncles in bed. She just wanted to make sure the children were safe.
Right.
And that she was still guarding the house.
And also, even though we don't know who she was or her name, with me telling that story, she kind of still lives on long after her life.
Right. You know, remember the Bell Witch and all the other stories from East Tennessee, from Virginia, from Georgia, Missouri, just some of those stories that we all remember we've heard. And in Tennessee, there's so many stories that, for some reason, somebody said, well, we're the Bible Belt. We don't believe in spirits and ghosts walking around. And you just want to shake your head and say, okay, fine.
Yeah.
You know, but they do exist. And people realize they exist. They just don't want to admit it. They just don't want to be among the few people that say, oh, this really does exist. And they'll think I'm crazy, or, oh, they don't think I'm a churchgoer. Doesn't have anything to do with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said earlier, I mean, it's a lot of those people are the ones that'll pull me aside and say, well, I don't believe in ghosts. They just want to get that out of the way. And then they'll tell me their ghost story, you know, but
you're right.
But it's always kind of to the side when nobody else is around.
Right. Because they don't want to admit it.
Yeah. Yeah. I talked to one author not too long ago who said that in some places down here in the South, they wouldn't carry their book because it was dealing paranormal and that type of stuff. And I was like, wow, I've never heard of that before. Never thought, you know, that in 2020, that 2021, that would still be even an issue or relevant, you know?
Well, look at the other issues that are still going in 2021.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's just part of human nature. We don't agree with it. It's not a very flattering part, but it exists. Because why should people object to opening the mind to possibility?
Yeah, and I've always looked at it. I've always been a skeptical believer. I've seen so much stuff in my life. My house is haunted as well. I've talked about that on the show some. And I've seen so many things with my own eyes that there's no explanation for. But I'm also the type of paranormal investigator that I'm just not going to go into a place that I'm investigating and say this place is haunted. I have to see it. I have to experience something myself to prove to myself, you know, for one, that, okay, well, what's going on here is the people aren't having maybe mental issues, you know, that there's actually something going on, or people aren't reading into things that aren't paranormal, you know, like some old houses have pipes that bang, you know, just different stuff like that.
Yeah.
Maybe the AC or the heat's turning on and it's causing something to move, and people jump to conclusions with the paranormal sometimes. But yeah, I've always been a skeptical believer, and I've just seen and experienced too much. And then hearing other people's stories and hearing all these stories, it's kind of hard to say that, you know, even though we don't understand it, we try to put labels on it and try to understand it the best we can. But it's hard for anybody just to outright say it doesn't exist.
I know, but they do.
Right.
They do say that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why so many people are now, when they buy old homes in downtown areas or in older neighborhoods, the first thing they do, they'll call me and say, can you research this house for me? Can you tell me who lived here? What's the story here? Like there was one on East Main. They said, what is the story here? Because we keep hearing things in a bedroom upstairs that overlooks the street. Well, as it was, there was a gentleman that hung himself in that bedroom because the family didn't want anybody to know how he died. You know, it was kept real quiet and, of course, not revealed to the future homeowners.
Right.
Even though it happened in the 40s. But that was where he hung himself. And what they were hearing was probably his spirit still there. But, they want to research. A lot of people want to research the houses, find out what went on there, what kind of people lived there before. And that's fun, too, because, like I said, the houses don't argue with you.
Right, right. Yeah, and so and even though people want to sweep stuff like that under the rug, it's still part of history, and it's still, you can't deny that it happened. It really happened.
Right. Yeah, but in the South, and I know that there are just generations of people that have skeletons in their closets, literally.
Yeah, yeah.
That don't want the neighbors to know about. In the 1920s, people that would keep children that had possibly a learning disability would keep them hidden in the house and would not want anybody to know about it. Or in Brownsville, I know of stories where whole families, if they had a young person that was what we know now as gay, they wouldn't let anybody know, and they would hide them. They would send them off to school, in other words. They didn't want the neighborhood to know. And that's just some of the stories that you heard from back then.
Yeah.
And you start integrating stories about ghosts, that really upsets the family tree.
Yeah. Well, even back then, it was okay to put a woman in a mental institution for hysteria, and it was just a blanket term. Like if a husband didn't want to deal with his wife anymore, he'd just put her, or she's giving him too much flack about something, he would just go commit her forever.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I mean, how many people in Bolivar were committed that way?
Yeah.
What used to be the Western State Institution.
Yeah.
And in Memphis, at one of the ones down there. And of course, there's stories all around where the psychiatric hospital is on what used to be there in Memphis, that on certain nights you hear the screams and the crying.
Yeah, I think it's funny when you said that. I heard your cat in the background.
I
Good timing from the cat.
Yeah. She's not really crazy about ghost stories. Even though she has seen the spirits here.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people believe cats are more in tune. I have dogs, and sometimes they react to stuff that you can't see in our house, but cats seem to be more in tune with paranormal stuff.
Cats and babies. I mean, the lady we had at the office downtown, one of the girls had a newborn, and by the time it was 6 weeks old, she was bringing it to work. And that baby would be entertained for hours, and we would not see what was keeping her entertained, but it was our ghost. Every once in a while you'll hear a rattler, and it was moving, but it wasn't the baby, and nobody else was around it.
Yeah.
And the baby was, billing and cooing because it could see the spirit, and it wasn't afraid. So, it's just amazing how, as we get older, we built in fear in our children. Yeah. So that's just part of life, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. So earlier, we've been talking a lot about downtown Jackson. Earlier, you were talking about some of the other stories from Madison County. And what are some of the other interesting stories that you heard around Madison County?
Well, in Denmark, during the Civil War, so many people were killed down there. And when the troops would come in, they would take the horses and, confiscate them. And some of the horses were killed. Well, there's a story about one particular horse that they call Mr. Billy, which is funny because the historian for Denmark is Mr. Billy. And the horse was taken, he was killed, but every once in a while people would see him in the field. He had a favorite mule that he hung out with, and they would see him in the field with that mule. So it's not only people and spirits, it's spirits of the animals too. I was telling that story one day down at Denmark at they had the cemetery walks. I was telling that story, and this little girl who lived across the street from the church was sitting beside me, and she said, "Miss D," I said, "What, honey? Do you see that mule and that horse? Oh, Miss Mary's going to be mad because they don't have saddles on." And it was Mr. Billy and the mule walking down toward the cemetery, and she was seeing them. It is amazing
Yeah.
to see what the kids see and see the spirits and the people that still wander. In the cemetery, when they did that cemetery walk, I went down there as they were closing it out. It was nighttime, and they kept seeing lights in the corner. Well, they couldn't figure out what was going on, so finally one brave soul walked over there, and when he got over there were no lights. And by the time he walked back, they had moved. You know, there was no reason for the car lights to be out or flashlights, but somebody or something was moving in that cemetery. And it wasn't like regular lights, it was like a lantern light. So needless to say, some of the actors who had been at the cemetery walk and portrayed the different characters left real fast. It was funny because there they were standing by gravestones talking about people that were dead, and then when something spooky happens, they leave.
Yeah, and that's what they were there for.
Right. They were there to tell the stories. And there's so many cemeteries down there and so many stories and so many spirits that are around there. Not only of the soldiers that perished in the battles, but the Indians and the settlers that died. Not necessarily of conflict, but of disease. Like the two little boys that drowned in the river. So, yeah, they're just stories everywhere.
Yeah, there's a famous ghost light story in Chapel Hill Cemetery in McKenzie out in West Tennessee that it's around some burial mounds, Native American burial mounds, and they've seen these lights bounce around above the trees and the gravestones at night.
Oh, that wouldn't surprise me at all because those are sacred mounds.
Yeah.
There's one down in close to Estonale, which is right close to the river, the Apache River. There are mounds down there that they have found that were, well, for lack of a better word, residential mounds or hunting mounds, where people would come in and create a village and hunt that land. But before winter set in or the flood season set in, they would leave. But there are all sorts of stories down there.
Yeah, and you were talking about the Pinson mounds earlier. Those are that's the biggest mound site in the United States.
Yes, and they were ceremonial mounds. They weren't residential. They weren't, village. Those were ceremonial mounds. People would come there like Mecca, come there to celebrate the lives of people that they had lost that year.
Yeah.
And remember people. I mean, look in Mexico, how they have the Day of the Dead.
Yeah.
They celebrate people that have passed on. And they don't want to forget them because that's just what it is.
So I always like to ask this of my guests, especially when we're talking ghost stories and like you, people have researched, all these different stories. What's the weirdest story that you've heard from the Jackson area?
Oh, gosh, there's so many of them. I guess the weirdest one would be the American Indian. Well, he was a Native American that was what they called a half-breed, and he was caught talking to a white lady and consequently was hung. And my favorite story about him is every once in a while in downtown or out by Riverside Cemetery, you can hear him singing.
Wow.
And it's just really a sorrowful song, and it's a song of his native tongue. But you can tell it's a love song.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was one of the weird ones. And they're just all sorts of ones, like the ones where the gentleman that was caught cheating at a gambling ring, and two men came and found him the next day at the store he worked. Well, he disappeared, and they didn't know what happened to him, and they buried him under the staircase. I mean, they just killed him, put him under there. Well, of course, later they found him, but he haunted that building for a long time. But then, of course, that was so funny. They arrested someone for that murder. They arrested this man for murdering this guy when they knew it was the gamblers that had killed him. But they arrested this man, they sent him to prison, and he got out in a week. So, yeah, there are all sorts of weird stories and strange spirits.
Yeah. And they all have a story to tell.
Oh, yeah. And I'll never stop researching them, and I'll never stop telling them because I want people to know. Not necessarily my cat, other people.
Well, I've had a wonderful time talking to you today, and I thank you so much for coming on my show.
Oh, you're very welcome. Anytime you want to discuss ghosts, just give me a call. And anytime you want to come down to Jackson and we want to ride around, just come on down and we'll make an arrangement to do that so you can see some of these places.
Yeah, I'd love to do that with researching the book that I'm writing, and definitely this spring when it warms up, we're not iced and snowed in.
Right, and no COVID to hang over our head.
All right, everybody, we thank you for listening. As always, stay safe out there. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or at our website, unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And don't forget to like, review, rate, and share with all your friends. Thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. Listen to our theme song and more of his music at chrislipsmusic.com. And remember, some of the scariest things are unseen.